Nestled deep within the Bavarian countryside, surrounded by whispering forests and muddy tracks that became impassable in winter, Hinterkaifeck was a lonely farmstead that rarely drew attention. Located roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich, between the small towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, the farm was a quiet place, the kind of home where seasons moved slower and the world outside seemed to fade. The Gruber family had lived here for years. Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, was a stern, often harsh man in his early 60s. A devout Catholic, Andreas was known by neighbors as strict and sometimes unfriendly. His wife, Cecilia, just a few years younger, was quieter, more withdrawn. Together, they ran the farm with their widowed daughter, Victoria Gabriel, her 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, and the family's maid, Maria Baumgartner. It was a modest, hard-working life. Until it wasn't. From the outside, nothing seemed particularly unusual. But in the months leading up to March 1922, strange things began to unfold on the Hinterkaifeck farm. Andreas Gruber, a man not easily shaken, had complained to neighbors about oddities around the property. Footprints had been found in the snow, leading from the woods to the farm, but none going back. Keys disappeared, only to turn up days later. The family heard footsteps in the attic, and Andreas swore he heard whispering when no one was near. Still, despite the warnings from others to report it, Andreas kept it all within the household. Perhaps out of pride, or perhaps out of fear. Even the former maid had left 6 months earlier, saying the house was haunted. It was only a few days before the murders that Andreas made his final, most chilling complaint. He found a strange newspaper on the property, a publication from Munich that no one in the family subscribed to. He asked neighbors if it belonged to them. It didn't. No one could explain how it ended up at Hinterkaifeck. Despite all these signs, the family remained. And on the evening of March 31st, 1922, life at Hinterkaifeck came to a sudden, violent end. But before we step into the blood-soaked barn and confront the brutality that took place, it's important to understand the isolation of the Grubers. Their farm was not just physically distant, but emotionally detached from the nearby village of Gruber. The Grubers were not popular. Andreas, in particular, had a reputation. Locals gossiped about his strict discipline and the unsettling rumors that he had an inappropriate relationship with his daughter, Victoria. There had even been a court case. In 1915, both Andreas and Victoria were convicted of incest, a dark, disturbing fact that cast a shadow over the family for years. While both served short prison sentences, the stigma remained. It drove a wedge between them and the villagers, further isolating the family. Still, the farm kept running. Victoria was a talented singer in the local church choir, and she kept the children close. The eldest, young Cecilia, was lively and talkative. Joseph, the toddler, was said to be the illegitimate child of Victoria, though no one knew for sure who the father was. Some whispered it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and former suitor of Victoria. Others said it was Andreas himself. The truth was murky, buried beneath layers of shame and silence. In March 1922, a new maid, Maria Baumgartner, arrived at the farm. Her first day of work was March 31st. That same night, she would be murdered alongside the rest of the household. The Grubers never made it to church that Sunday. The children didn't show up for school on Monday. By Tuesday, the postman noticed mail piling up at the gate. Still, no one thought to investigate. It wasn't until April 4th, 5 days after the murders, that neighbors finally went to the farm. What they found was a scene that would haunt the village for generations. This chapter isn't just about the family. It's about the atmosphere, the chilling quiet of Hinterkaifeck, the isolation that muffled screams, the superstitions that discouraged questions, the broken trust within a family and between neighbors. It's a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't come screaming down the path. Sometimes it walks slowly, silently, with footprints that never go back the way they came. As we continue this story, we'll peel back the layers of horror that unfolded on that cold spring night in 1922. But first, remember Hinterkaifeck as it was before. A quiet farmstead, steeped in secrets, standing alone against the edge of a dark forest. Because before the blood, before the suspicions and theories, there was just a family that never saw what was coming. The morning of April 4th, 1922, dawned with a chill that clung to the Bavarian countryside. The town of Gruber, where the Hinterkaifeck farmstead lay secluded and silent, had already begun to stir. Church bells tolled gently, the sky cast in a pale grey mist that promised little warmth. Life in rural Bavaria was slow and predictable, shaped by the rhythms of nature and the Catholic calendar. Yet something was off that morning. At the Hinterkaifeck farm, a place usually alive with the early hustle of chores and the lowing of cows, there was only stillness. Neighbors had begun to take note. Over the past several days, none of the Gruber family members had been seen in town. Young Cecilia hadn't shown up at school, and Victoria, her mother, hadn't appeared at church, a rarity for the deeply religious woman. Mail had begun to pile up, and the local postman, who usually exchanged pleasantries with Andreas Gruber, had been greeted by an eerily silent homestead for days. That morning, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and sometimes rival of Andreas Gruber, decided to investigate. He'd been harboring unease for some time now. The Grubers had not been seen since March 31st, and with every passing day, his concern grew. He gathered two neighbors, Jakob Sigel and Michael Pöhl, and set out toward Hinterkaifeck. As they neared the farm, something in the air shifted. The farmyard was quiet. Too quiet. The dog, usually heard barking ferociously at strangers, was strangely subdued. It sat tied up in the barn, whining softly. The men approached the barn first. The large wooden door creaked open under Schlittenbauer's hand. A musty scent of hay and decay hit them instantly. The barn was dark, but not entirely silent. The animals stirred restlessly, their unease mirroring that of their human visitors. Schlittenbauer stepped in first, eyes adjusting to the dim light. What he saw would stay with him forever. Beneath a layer of hay and straw, partially hidden by a wooden door propped against the wall, lay the bodies. 4 of them: Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, Victoria, and the young girl Cecilia. All had been struck repeatedly, their faces unrecognizable, blood staining the ground where it had pooled and dried. The men recoiled in horror. Jakob Sigel gasped. Michael Pöhl stepped back with his hand over his mouth. Schlittenbauer stood frozen, eyes locked on the grisly sight. There was no doubt something horrific had taken place at Hinterkaifeck. Once the initial shock subsided, the men ventured further. In the main house, they discovered the body of the maid, Maria Baumgartner, in her bed. She had arrived only the day before the murders, replacing the previous maid who had left due to unexplained fears. Maria had been killed in the same brutal manner. In a crib nearby lay the youngest victim, 2-year-old Joseph, Victoria's son. His tiny body, too, bore the marks of the same weapon. Panic and revulsion overtook them. The police in nearby Schrobenhausen were notified immediately, and officers soon arrived at the farm. Word of the massacre spread quickly through Gruber and surrounding villages. Townspeople gathered outside the farmhouse, whispering prayers and speculations. Few could comprehend the savagery of the crime. Who could be capable of such a thing? And why the Grubers? The initial investigation was chaotic. Crime scene protocols were rudimentary in 1922, and curious onlookers, villagers, neighbors, even police, trampled through the barn and house, disturbing potential evidence. The bodies were examined in situ, revealing the same horrifying pattern. Each had been killed by a series of blows to the head, likely with a pickaxe or similar tool. One of Victoria's wounds exposed her skull, and little Casilia appeared to have clumps of her own hair in her hands, suggesting she had torn it out in terror or pain before dying. The weapon was never found. Investigators puzzled over the order of the killings. It seemed that the family members had been lured one by one into the barn, where they were struck down and stacked like cordwood, then partially covered. The killer, or killers, had taken the time to conceal the bodies and clean the scene at least partially. More disturbingly, neighbors claimed that the chimney had been active in the days following March 31st. Someone had been inside the house after the murders. Food had been eaten, the animals fed, and the beds appeared slept in. Was the killer still there? Was he watching the investigation unfold from the shadows? Speculation ran rampant. Some villagers believed the Gruber family had been targeted due to a feud or perhaps jealousy. Others pointed fingers at vagrants or gypsies traveling through the area. But one name repeatedly surfaced: Lorenz Schlittenbauer. His connection to Victoria and young Joseph was well known. Rumors had long circulated that Lawrence might be Joseph's father, and that he and Andreas Gruber had bitter disagreements over the child's legitimacy. More questions than answers emerged. Why had no one heard the screams? Why were the animals calm, the dog left tied up? How had the killer stayed in the house unnoticed for days? And most chilling of all, what had driven them to such grotesque violence? The townspeople became fearful. Doors that had once remained unlocked were now bolted at night. Children were kept indoors, and a pall of anxiety hung heavy over Gruber. The murders were not just a tragedy. They had shattered the illusion of safety in their close-knit rural world. Police interrogated numerous suspects. Schlittenbauer, despite being the one to discover the bodies, was questioned closely. His intimate knowledge of the farm and strange behavior during the search raised suspicions. He knew too much, some thought, had moved the bodies, entered rooms others dared not, and shown little visible emotion. He claimed it was shock. No charges were brought. The community mourned. 6 coffins were paraded through the town, drawing crowds from nearby villages. Black flags fluttered against gray skies as priests offered solemn rites. The Grubers were buried, but their story was far from over. Investigators from Munich and beyond continued to visit the site, now a grim landmark. Theories multiplied. Theories about incest, secrets, mental illness, revenge, and stranger danger. Eventually, with few leads and a crime scene long since compromised, the official investigation began to falter. But the horror endured. In the stories whispered by candlelight, in the nervous glances over shoulders, in the shadow of Hinterkaifeck's deserted farmhouse. The murder scene was left undisturbed for weeks. Eventually, the buildings were torn down, the land left fallow. The skulls of the victims were sent to Munich for forensic analysis, but were lost during World War II bombings. The graves remain, marked and visited, but the voices of the dead offer no more clues. In the following years, a strange fascination took root. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and crime historians returned to Hinterkaifeck, each hoping to uncover the secret buried in that remote patch of land. But each found only echoes, of footsteps in the barn, of wind through empty rooms, of unanswered questions. The Hinterkaifeck murders had become more than a crime. They were a myth, a haunting, a puzzle without edges. And the killer, it seemed, had vanished into the fog of time. In the aftermath of the horrific discovery at the Hinterkaifeck farm, the village of Gruber fell into a state of fearful unrest. The senseless brutality, coupled with the eerie circumstances surrounding the murders, had shaken the local community to its core. People whispered rumors. Suspicion grew like mold in the damp air, and eyes once friendly became filled with doubt and fear. But for the authorities, there was little time for mourning. A crime of such magnitude demanded swift investigation, and so the wheels of justice began to turn. The first step was securing the crime scene, though in truth, by the time police arrived, any chance of preserving evidence had long since vanished. The bodies had been discovered by villagers on April 4th, 1922. And in the days that followed, a steady stream of neighbors, curious onlookers, and would-be helpers had trampled through the farmhouse and barn, unknowingly contaminating what should have been a pristine crime scene. Items were moved, doors opened and shut, and even the bodies were disturbed. In the absence of modern forensic practices, the chaos that ensued was tragically typical. Still, Inspector Georg Gruber of the Munich police did his best to gather what little evidence remained. He noted the placement of the bodies in the barn. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and granddaughter Cecilia, all piled atop one another and partly covered with hay. The family's maid, Maria Baumgartner, and young Joseph had been found in the house, murdered in their beds. It was clear the killer had taken their time, committing the murders in a methodical sequence. One of the most unsettling discoveries came from an examination of the barn floor. Blood patterns suggested that the victims had been lured into the barn one by one, likely under false pretenses. Perhaps the first to enter had heard a noise or seen something amiss. One by one, they were struck down with the blunt edge of a mattock, a pickaxe-like tool commonly used on farms. Despite the brutality, there was no sign of theft. Money, jewelry, and valuables remained untouched. The family's bank account had not been accessed, and nothing of value appeared missing. The motive, then, seemed personal rather than financial. As investigators combed through the farmhouse, they found further signs of the killer's unsettling presence. A newspaper not delivered to the farm had been found inside. Footprints led from the woods to the house, but none returned. Meals had been eaten and livestock cared for, all after the estimated time of death. Someone had stayed on the property after the murders, living amongst the corpses for days. The villagers' suspicion quickly turned toward the last man seen on the property. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. A neighbor and former suitor of Victoria, Schlittenbauer had a long and complicated history with the Gruber family. When the family ceased attending church and rumors of ghostly noises at Hinterkaifeck began to circulate, Schlittenbauer was one of the few people to take the claims seriously. It was he who organized a group to investigate when the family went silent, and it was he who first entered the barn and found the bodies. But his behavior on the day of the discovery raised eyebrows. He had opened doors with keys that no one knew he had, and walked through the house with familiarity and apparent calm. Was it shock or something more sinister? The police interrogated Schlittenbauer multiple times, but he remained adamant that he had nothing to do with the murders. He claimed to have received a key from Andreas prior to the crime, something that could not be verified. He explained his calm demeanor as a result of having prepared himself mentally for the worst. Still, whispers of his involvement never truly died. Yet Schlittenbauer was far from the only suspect. The Munich investigators expanded their net to include anyone who might have had a grudge against the Grubers. Andreas, by all accounts, was a difficult man. He had been convicted in 1915 for incest with Victoria, and many believed the abuse continued. Victoria, meanwhile, was said to have had relationships with multiple men in the area, some married. Jealousy, vengeance, or shame could all have been motives. Then there was the maid, Maria Baumgartner. She had arrived at the farm the very day of the murders, taking over from a previous maid who had quit in a panic, claiming the house was haunted. Baumgartner's sister had accompanied her to the farm and returned home shortly after, making her one of the last people to see the family alive. Her testimony added to the air of mystery. She said her sister had been nervous but resolute about taking the job, despite knowing of the family's reputation. More outlandish theories began to emerge as well. Some villagers believed the killer had been living in the attic for days, perhaps weeks, before the crime. Strange noises had been reported, and a house key had gone missing. Could someone have been hiding in the shadows, watching and waiting? The idea that the killer had crept through the attic beams, descending at night to stalk his victims, was terrifying, but not impossible. Despite a lack of hard evidence, the police pushed forward. They collected statements from over 100 people, sending interrogations as far as neighboring towns and cities. They examined criminal records, former soldiers, mental asylum patients, and itinerant workers. They even investigated a pair of brothers known to have had bad blood with Andreas, but found no compelling evidence linking them to the crime. In an attempt to gather more insight, the authorities turned to the Munich Police Academy, enlisting the help of detective trainees to re-examine the case. Diagrams were made, timelines created, and forensic sketches drafted. A reconstruction of the crime was performed, using mannequins and volunteers to simulate the sequence of events. But again, the lack of preserved evidence made conclusions speculative at best. One of the most bizarre moments came when clairvoyants and spiritualists were brought in, at the suggestion of desperate locales. Seances were held, and mediums claimed to sense an evil presence at the farm. Of course, none of these efforts yielded any concrete results, but they highlighted the desperation and fear that had taken hold of the community. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the authorities made a grim decision. They exhumed the bodies. In a macabre scene, the corpses were transported to Munich, where the heads were removed and sent to clairvoyants for psychic analysis. The results were, predictably, inconclusive. Worse yet, the skulls were never returned. During the chaos of World War II, they were lost or destroyed, adding yet another layer of tragedy to the case. Years passed, and the investigation slowed. Occasional tips would trickle in, prompting a brief flurry of activity, but nothing ever came of them. The case officially remained open until 1955, though by that point it was little more than a file gathering dust. The haunting nature of the crime never faded, however. New generations of detectives and amateur sleuths would revisit the case, poring over old documents and faded photographs. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck became a staple of true crime lore, its eerie details lending themselves to endless speculation. In recent years, an alternative possibility has emerged that introduces a chilling new dimension to the case: the notion that the killer may have been a transient serial murderer, possibly from the United States. This theory, proposed by American author and statistician Bill James in his 2017 book, The Man from the Train, suggests that the person responsible for the Hinterkaifeck massacre may not have been a neighbor or relative, but rather a globe-trotting killer named Paul Müller. Paul Müller was a German immigrant and a fugitive from justice in the United States. He was the only suspect in the 1897 to 1898 murder of a Massachusetts family, where an axe was used to kill a man, his wife, and their daughter. When questioned, Müller disappeared, never to be apprehended. James theorizes that Müller fled and began a cross-country killing spree, targeting isolated families living near railroad tracks. Trains, the authors argue, were key to Müller's ability to evade capture. He would enter a town under cover of darkness, commit his crimes, and vanish before dawn. The theory holds that Müller was a cunning and adaptable killer. He selected his victims with care, often choosing families with prepubescent daughters, a disturbing detail that points to a sexual component in some of the crimes. His modus operandi included disabling the family dog, either killing or isolating it, removing window panes or using entry points that avoided breaking locks, and stacking bodies in unusual arrangements. These elements would reappear again and again across multiple crime scenes, creating a signature that many local authorities failed to recognize due to jurisdictional limitations and the lack of centralized databases at the time. What makes the Möller theory so compelling in the context of Hinterkaifeck is the eerie alignment of details. Like many of the American axe murders catalogued by James, the Hinterkaifeck killings involved an entire family annihilated in their home. The murder weapon was a mattock, a farm tool similar to an axe. No items of value were taken, and the killer exhibited strange behavior after the fact, such as remaining in the home and feeding the animals. In addition, the bodies at Hinterkaifeck were stacked in the barn, partially covered with hay, reminiscent of how Möller sometimes arranged his victims. The killer at Hinterkaifeck also appeared to have experience with rural life and farming equipment, another trait attributed to Möller. One of the most peculiar aspects of the Hinterkaifeck case was the killer's comfort with staying at the crime scene. Neighbors reported smoke rising from the chimney in the days following the murders, and food had been consumed in the kitchen. This behavior mirrors incidents in the United States, where it appeared the killer lingered at scenes post-murder, as though savoring the horror he had created. Most significantly, however, was the killer's presumed use of the railway system. Hinterkaifeck, though remote, was not far from a train station. If Möller had indeed returned to Germany after heat from American investigations intensified, he could have resumed his killing spree, falling into familiar patterns. With knowledge of both German and rural American landscapes, he would have found it easy to blend in. However, the theory is not without its weaknesses. There is no definitive evidence that Möller ever returned to Germany, let alone that he was in Bavaria in 1922. The link between him and the Hinterkaifeck case is purely circumstantial and based on patterns rather than hard proof. Moreover, while many of Möller's suspected murders were in English-speaking communities, it is unclear whether he retained fluency in German, especially after decades abroad. Another criticism is that the theory risks stretching circumstantial evidence too far. Axe murders, while brutal, were unfortunately not uncommon during that era, especially in rural settings where axes were standard household tools. The similarities in method might reflect common environmental and logistical factors rather than a single mastermind. A century has passed since 6 lives were brutally extinguished on that remote Bavarian farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. Yet despite the years, the brutal slayings remain as chilling and unresolved as they were on the cold morning of March 31st, 1922. What lingers is not only the mystery of who committed the murders, but the disturbing clarity with which we understand that something so horrific can vanish into silence, unanswered and unaccounted for. What makes this case so captivating isn't just its horror, but its contradictions. A killer, or killers, moved freely on that farm after the murders, feeding livestock, cooking meals, even milking cows, for days. They buried the bodies haphazardly, half hidden under straw. There was no robbery, no escape plan. And somehow, in a small farming community where everyone knew everyone, no one was ever brought to justice. The last official investigation into Hinterkaifeck ended in 1986. With the death of the last detective to review the case, the files were closed. DNA evidence was never collected, and modern forensic tools, which might have helped, came far too late. Today, the farm is gone. It was demolished in 1923, a year after the murders. No monument marks the site, no graves lie on the property, only fading memories and speculation remain. For those 6 souls lost in the darkness, Andreas, Cecilia Sina, Victoria, little Cecilia Jr., Joseph, and Maria Baumgartner, we owe remembrance. Whether victims of a deeply personal betrayal or the final chapter of a roaming killer's spree, they remind us that history's most unsettling stories are not always the ones that are solved.